Hey, thank you. All right, there's nothing like being in a room full of aspiring and successful entrepreneurs. So, what I'd like you to do to kick things off, look at the people around you. You've got a room full of entrepreneurs, and I want you to introduce yourself to someone and share a hunch as to how entrepreneurs are different than the average American. Okay, take 30 seconds. Statistically, how are entrepreneurs and small business owners different than the average American? Share with someone next to you. 30 seconds. Okay, I know we're on a short time frame, so I'm gonna go through this. So LegalZoom, we have an interesting perspective on small business owners and entrepreneurs in general. We've formed literally over 1 million businesses. We're the largest former of small businesses in the world. And literally our team has had millions of conversations with entrepreneurs. So within that, what I'd like to do today is share a deeper profile of who are small business owners and entrepreneurs. I'm going to talk about a few alarming trends and share a few reasons for optimism. So let's start with the bad news first. Many people may know this, but the US is experiencing a long-term and alarming decline in business starts. This is not a cyclical thing, it's 40 years of bad. Here's a quote from the Conf Foundation that follows entrepreneurship for many a decade. Despite the recent positive trend, startup activity is still below the levels of the Great Recession. And startups with employees are still on a long-term decline. What does that actually look like? This is the startup density per 100,000 people. So from 77 to basically today, we're on a constant slide. So America, the country of entrepreneurship, not looking so hot. So you'll see in politics, not gonna get into politics right now, but many people will cite small business as the engine of job growth in the US. If that's the case, we are starting to stall. And clouds have been on the horizon for many a year, and it's getting worse. So what I'd like to do is get a better understanding of that engine of job growth, just to set the context. First, who are small business owners? And I want to begin with the caveat. Statistics about small business owners can be misleading because not every small business owner is a small business employer. If you dive into the numbers, there are about roughly 30 million small businesses in the US, as classified by the census and the SBA. About 24 million are self-employed. The average revenues of those 24 million without employees is 44,000, 2/3 less than $25,000 a year in revenue. So a lot of those are part-time businesses, getting things started, no employees. What we want to focus on is the 5.8 million, roughly 6 million businesses with 1 to 499 employees. That is the engine of job growth that we're talking about. And what do we mean by job creation? Those 5.8 million employer firms created 58 million jobs, or about 65% of the net new jobs in the United States. This is about 10 employees per small business employer on average, right? Again, that definition's by the SBA, 1 to 499. If you go deeper, there are 121 million total jobs in the US. Larger companies, 500 plus employees, are a little more than half. Small businesses are a little less than half. Now, if you look at where that job creation exists, think of it in rough thirds. About a third come from the larger segment of 20 to call it 100 to 499 employees. That's about a third of it, roughly. There's about a third, roughly, in the 20 to 99 employees, and about a third in this 1 to 19. So when you think about small business, I want you to think of 1 to 19, 20 to 99, and then 100 to 499. So actually, what it says is this engine is actually relatively diverse. And it's really important. You can't take out a third. The ones that 1 to 19 employees actually is critical, the engine of job growth, just as much as the larger ones. Myth versus reality, the American entrepreneur. So think of an entrepreneur today. What comes to mind? Male or female? Caucasian or minority? Immigrant or native born? Younger or older? Because we've got these myths. There's the Horatio Alger myth, which is actually a myth, of this rags to riches, coming up without an education, striking a pick, making good in the US. We have immigrants that definitely come to the US with nothing that create amazing companies. You have startup folks out of the garage, but who are they? What's the real picture of the typical entrepreneur? Are they college educated or not? This is the reality. Statistically, small business owners are more likely to be in their early 40s. 40s is the golden age of entrepreneurship. They have a college education. They are far more educated than the average American. They are highly likely to be foreign-born relative to the rest of the population. They are higher earners than the average. They're more in the upper middle class. It's less rags to riches if you look at the engine of job growth. And they tend to be from families of entrepreneurs, which is interesting. So let me dive a little bit deeper into those statistics. Unfortunately, women entrepreneurs are lagging. Over the last 20 years, we have not made headway into female entrepreneurship. It's greater now in tech than before, but as a whole across the US, we've gone from 20 years ago, about 44% of small business owners being female, to, in 2015, 40%. So we've come backwards. And whether you think that's going slightly backwards or relatively flat, it's not getting better. And I think that's the bigger trend. I mentioned the golden decade of entrepreneurs are the 40s, and we are losing young entrepreneurs and gaining older ones. So if you look 20 years ago, when you're younger, that's about 34%. Then you take this golden age, call it 35 to 54, that's the centerpiece. Then I call silver fox entrepreneurs, 55 and up, right, at about 15%. When you fast forward to today, it's almost exactly a quarter. So we've lost, in 20 years, a lot of the young entrepreneurs, and we've gained a lot of older entrepreneurs. The middle's roughly balanced out. Relative to the overall US population, I mentioned entrepreneurs are more educated, and they're actually growing more educated over time. College graduates for entrepreneurs were about 50% of entrepreneurs 20 years ago. Now they're just under 60%, and that compares to the US population of just under 40%. So US population just under 40%. 20 years ago, it was just over 50%. Now it's just under 60%. So more and more educated. Many entrepreneurs are making close to 6 figures at the time of their startup. The average income falls into a range of about $75,000 to $99,000. In the last 20 years, we've seen a very significant rise in foreign-born entrepreneurs. Immigrants have always been more entrepreneurial, but that gap is actually continuing to widen. And there's some kind of fun and interesting facts around this. First, 20 years ago, immigrants represented about 13% of small business owners. In 2015, it's now about 27%, so more than doubled. And the rate of new entrepreneurs by country of origin, you can see it rising dramatically. So the immigrants are actually becoming more and more entrepreneurial over the last 20 years. Why is the engine of job growth slowing? What is behind this systemic 40-year decline? That the decline is obvious. The number of new companies as a share of US businesses has dropped 44% in the last 20 years. Or actually in the last 40 years, sorry, that's devastating. You look at this, new companies as share, that's another way of looking at this graph. with a little steeper decline. And we actually hit a negative tipping point. After a 40-year decline about 5 years ago, small business deaths actually outweighed births for small business for the first time in the history of the US. And you'll see that breaking now. The Great Recession was an unusual time, but you see the bounce back isn't that great. And they've been coming close. This becomes a tipping point that has deep ramifications for the health of our economy and for society. What's causing that deterioration? Now, our thesis first is that it comes down to money and people. I would say that there is a high correlation with the rising cost of education and entrepreneurship, and I'm going to share some of that data. The second, and on the positive side, stemming this decline, is the immigrant effect. If you think of this ship that's been leaking for small business, immigrants are the one thing that have been plugging that leak for that engine of job growth. And as we change those policies, they will have deep ramifications. So the rising cost of education, if the sweet spot for entrepreneurship is in the early 40s, the impending cost of higher education is looming large and actually negatively impacting your desire to be an entrepreneur. The cost of education in the last 20 years has gone up 296% for public universities in state. It's gone up 226% for out-of-state tuition. It's gone up 179% for private universities. This is wildly outpacing inflation. Now, private already started high, so they had less to go. But before in the UC system, I was talking to a CFO, and he said, hey, it cost me $4,000 to go to UCLA and UCLA Business School, tuition for all 6 years. Now, the average total cost is $131,000 compared to $52,000 20 years ago. The average student loan is almost tripled from $12,000 to $35,000. If you look at the typical family, where you're seeing 2.4 kids, not sure what the 0.4 kids looks like, but that ends up costing quite a bit. And the average, compare the cost of raising 2.4 children and the $49,000 on average that small business employers take to start their business. Family of 2.4 kids equates to over $300,000 of college tuition. Subtract the $35,000 of debt that the average kid will take on. And you think about that $49,000, and what is the conclusion? Small business owners have to weigh funding their dream, not against my retirement, not against my savings, but against whether I may or may not be able to pay for my children's education. Millennials aren't starting companies like boomers did. It's actually a significantly smaller percent. They were hailed as the most entrepreneurial generation, and they're actually going to be the least entrepreneurial generation in a very long time. That light blue line is the rate of entrepreneurship by age, and that's the 20 to 34. 33% of millennials have a college degree, but because of their college debt, they can't fund a business. I was talking to one of our Zoomers, and she had graduated 2 years ago, and she wanted to be an entrepreneur. I said, oh, how come you didn't jump? You jumped here instead of there. Is it to be a learning experience? She said, no, I have $1,100 a month in debts. The first thing I didn't want to do as an entrepreneur was default to the US government. And I think, wow, that's a different kind of risk. It's a different kind of obligation. We asked small business owners, what are the realities of starting and running your business? How'd that affect you in your personal life? And 21% said they delayed getting married or having children because they wanted to start their business. The shocking data that came out of LegalZoom, and this is coming across hundreds of thousands of small business owners every year, when we back-matched with Experian our data, if you were under 40, the percentage with kids, it used to be everyone under 40 started a small business, a little more than half, 56-ish% had children. In 6 years, that's gone down to almost 45%. So if you're under 40, the entrepreneurs with kids, you've taken a lot of that out of the system. In just the last 6 years, that's a very dramatic shift. We form 37% of the business in California. So this is across a pretty large subsection. In contrast, those that have had children, have paid for the education, are now entering entrepreneurship at higher levels. So you see entrepreneurs over 40 with children growing dramatically, from 50% to now almost 70%. So people are going after the dream, but they're delaying it significantly. Parents have to sacrifice their children's education to start a business, or they graduate with terrible debt. And if we don't fix this systemic issue, the next 20 years are going to be pretty rough. Quickly on the immigrant effect. Foreign-born small business owners have a very significant impact. 7 of the 10 most valuable brands in the world were launched by immigrants or children of immigrants. And that goes from Apple to IBM to McDonald's. Take a look at foreign-born tech, and you'll see a lot of, you got Sergey, you got Google, you got eBay, PayPal, Elon Musk, South African, Yahoo, Jerry, across the board. Again, 13.7% of the US population is foreign-born. 30% of the entrepreneurs in 2011 are foreign-born. 52% of Silicon Valley startups from 1995 to 2005 were founded by immigrants. Tech in particular is heavily immigrant dependent. 45% of the high-tech Fortune 500 companies were founded by an immigrant or the child of an immigrant. They're twice as likely to start a business, and 23% of new American companies. Top 10 countries will shock you. It's actually kind of a Benetton ad of We Are the World. The most entrepreneurial, and this is defined as percentage of adult Americans working at least 15 hours, so working Americans that own their own business, Iran is number 1. Almost 1/4. Do we have Persians in the? Yes. Contributing to the economy. 1 in 4 adult Americans own their own businesses. Koreans are number 2, just under 1 in 4 as well. Brazilians, number 3. Then, interestingly enough, Italy and Poland. So you get the Middle East, you get Asia, you get Europe. South America is huge, with Brazil rounding in at number 3. So you actually have a great breakout here. If you take the Fortune 500, founded by immigrants, children of immigrants, in the US, that would be 4.2 trillion in revenues, or the 3rd largest country in the world. If you just go Fortune 500 founded by immigrants, you would still be in the top 10 at 1.7 trillion. So immigration has moderated this decline of business starts in the last 2 decades. And any reversal in policies could make this crisis significantly worse. We don't also think of the trickle-down effect. For every 100 H-1B workers, you're actually adding an additional 183 jobs for Americans. So this new policy on H-1B, freezing premium processing for tech, will have a negative impact, and that's at a time that capital has gone global. We're competing for people. And if we can't compete for people, we can't create jobs. And so, to conclude, what I wanted to do was shine a light on an alarming trend. And if we shine a light and begin to understand it, we can then begin to think through systemic solutions. That's a topic for a different talk, though. So I think that is my time. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.